I didn't tell anyone about the missing door. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it without sounding uncertain myself. The building didn't feel dangerous. Nothing had happened. There was no moment I could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." So I kept living there. Days turned into weeks. The routine came back faster than I expected. I learned the timing of the elevator again, the way it hesitated before closing, the hours when the hallway lights stayed on a little longer. I started leaving for work at the same time each morning, coming home just after dark most nights. The building always sounded the same when I returned. Quiet, but never empty. At first, I kept checking the door numbers every time I walked down the hall. I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more. A habit. But after a while, I stopped looking directly at the space where the missing door should have been. I knew where it was. I could feel it without turning my head. That became another habit. The hallway didn't change, not really. The paint stayed scuffed in the same places. The carpet still smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old dust. But the longer I lived there, the more deliberate everything felt. Like the building had settled into a specific way of being, and it expected me to do the same. I started noticing patterns I hadn't paid attention to before. Doors that opened and closed at the same times every day. Lights that went off in sequence, never all at once. Even the sounds followed a rhythm. Footsteps above me at night. Pipes ticking in the walls just before dawn. It was consistent enough to feel intentional, but not enough to prove anything. I told myself that was normal. Buildings had rhythms. People created patterns without realizing it. That explanation worked, at least on the surface. Sometimes I would see other residents in passing. We didn't talk. No one ever seemed in a hurry, but no one lingered either. Brief eye contact in the stairwell, a nod near the mailboxes. It felt less like avoidance and more like an unspoken agreement not to interfere. I never saw anyone stand in the hallway for no reason. At night, the building felt heavier, not darker exactly. Just quieter in a way that made sound feel unnecessary. I would lie awake listening, waiting for something to break the stillness. Most nights, nothing did. When something finally did make a noise, it felt like a reminder rather than an interruption. There were moments when I convinced myself the missing door had been a mistake, a miscount. A tired brain filling in gaps that weren't really there. I tried to picture the hallway as it would look if the numbering made sense again, but the image never stayed in my head for long. Something about it felt incorrect, like imagining furniture that had never been in the room. I stopped trying. The longer I lived there, the less the missing door felt like an absence. It felt like a boundary. A place I had learned not to cross without ever being told to stop. I didn't know when that shift happened. There was no clear moment when unease replaced curiosity. It crept in quietly, disguised as familiarity. The kind that makes you stop asking questions because everything appears to be working as it should. By the time I realized how comfortable I had become, it already felt too late to start paying attention again. That was when the first signs of order appeared. I started noticing it in the small things. At first, I thought it was coincidence. A flyer taped near the entrance that vanished overnight. A package left in the lobby that was gone by morning, without any sign of it being taken. Nothing dramatic. just absences that felt intentional once I started paying attention. The notice board near the stairs was always the same. Not empty, but never cluttered. One or two pieces of paper neatly aligned, edges squared as if someone had adjusted them by hand. I never saw anyone doing it. I never saw anyone reading them either. Still, they stayed where they were meant to stay. The trash room was another place that felt different after a while. The bins were never overflowing. Not once. No loose bags, no smell lingering longer than it should have. I found myself timing my visits there, not consciously, but with the sense that certain hours were better than others. Quieter. More acceptable. I couldn't have said why. The hallways began to feel less like shared spaces and more like corridors meant to be passed through quickly. No one leaned against the walls. No one stopped to check their phone. Conversations, if they happened at all, were brief and finished before anyone reached their door. It wasn't fear that kept people moving. It felt closer to habit. I noticed that doors rarely stayed open for long. Someone would step out, lock up, and leave without hesitation. When they returned, they unlocked their door and went inside immediately. No pauses. No standing in the hallway to adjust a bag or search for keys. It was as if the building discouraged lingering without ever saying so. Once, late in the evening, I paused near the stairwell longer than I meant to. I had dropped something and bent down to pick it up. Just a few seconds. When I straightened, the light above me flickered once, then steadied. It didn't go out, it didn't brighten, it simply reminded me it was there. I moved on without thinking about it. Over time, these details layered on top of one another, none of them alarming on their own. Together, they formed something structured, a sense that certain behaviors fit more easily into the building than others. I began adjusting without realizing it. I stopped checking my mail late at night. I took the elevator instead of the stairs if it was already waiting. I avoided standing in shared spaces unless I had a reason to be there. These weren't decisions I made consciously. They felt more like corrections, the kind you make when you realize you've been holding yourself wrong for too long. The missing door stayed where it was, or where it wasn't. I still avoided looking directly at that section of the hallway, but now it felt connected to the rest of the building in a way I couldn't articulate, like it wasn't just an absence but a reference point. Something the rest of the structure quietly oriented itself around. The idea that there might be rules crossed my mind more than once. Not posted ones, not written ones. The kind that don't need to be explained because everyone already seems to understand them. I told myself I was reading too much into it. People like order. Buildings develop routines. Patterns emerge whether anyone plans them or not. That explanation worked until the morning. I noticed something new taped to the notice board. It hadn't been there the night before. I almost walked past it. The notice board had always blended into the background. I was used to seeing it unchanged, something static I had trained myself not to examine too closely. That morning, I only noticed it because something about it interrupted the rhythm of the hallway. There was a new sheet of paper. It was centered perfectly on the board, not taped crookedly or pinned at an angle. The corners were flat. The paper itself looked clean, uncreased, as though it had been placed there carefully and recently. I stood a few steps away, reading it from a distance before I allowed myself to move closer. There was no heading, no logo, no letterhead, just a list. The text was typed, not handwritten, black ink on white paper. The font was plain, the kind you'd see on official notices or instruction manuals. Nothing about it tried to draw attention. That, more than anything, made me uneasy. I waited for the hallway to change, for someone to step out of a nearby apartment, for the elevator to arrive. Nothing happened. The building remained quiet, patient. I stepped closer and began to read. The rules were numbered. Not many of them. Enough to feel intentional. The first one was simple. Something about shared spaces and noise levels during certain hours. It sounded reasonable. The kind of thing you'd expect in any apartment building. I felt a brief sense of relief as I moved on to the second. That feeling didn't last. The next rule wasn't unreasonable either, but it was specific in a way that felt unnecessary. It mentioned a time window down to the minute. Not a general suggestion, but a precise instruction. I reread it twice, wondering why anyone would need that much accuracy. The third rule made my stomach tighten. It referenced doors. Not any door in particular, just doors, plural. It described how they were to be used, when they were to be opened, and how long they were allowed to remain that way. The wording was careful, neutral, as if whoever wrote it expected the reader to already understand what was being referred to. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading and rereading the list. Each rule on its own sounded manageable, ordinary even. Together, they felt less like guidelines and more like boundaries. Then, I reached the last one. It was shorter than the others. It mentioned a door that did not exist. Not in a metaphorical way, not as a warning. It was written as a fact, as if the absence itself had been accounted for and needed to be addressed. The rule didn't explain what the door was, or why it wasn't there. It didn't need to. It simply stated what was expected of anyone who encountered that part of the hallway. I became aware of how quiet everything was. Not the kind of quiet you notice immediately, but the kind that settles in after you've been standing still for too long. I could hear my own breathing, the faint hum of electricity somewhere in the walls. I looked around, half expecting someone to be watching me read. No one was there. I checked the board again, scanning for dates or signatures. There were none. No indication of who had posted the rules or when. The paper didn't even show signs of having been handled. No fingerprints, no curling edges. I told myself it had probably gone up early that morning. Maintenance, management. Someone responsible for keeping things in order. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't. As I stepped away from the notice board, I felt the same sensation I'd had when I first noticed the missing door. Not fear, not confusion. Something quieter. The sense that I'd been given information I hadn't asked for but was now expected to act on. I didn't tear the paper down. I didn't take a photo. I didn't confront anyone about it. I walked back to my apartment and locked the door behind me, more carefully than usual. For the rest of the day, the rules sat in the back of my mind. I followed them without thinking, adjusting my movements and timing as if I'd always known what was required. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the building settle, it occurred to me that no one had told me the rules existed. They had simply appeared. I didn't plan to break any of the rules. If anything, I was more careful after seeing them. I paid attention to the time. I kept my movements brief in shared spaces. I closed doors quickly and avoided anything that felt unnecessary. The rules weren't difficult to follow. That made them easy to accept. For a while, nothing happened. Days passed, then more days. The building remained quiet and orderly, just as it always had. The notice board stayed unchanged. The list didn't grow or shrink. It simply existed, waiting. I started to relax. The violation happened on an evening that felt unremarkable. I came home later than usual, distracted and tired. The elevator took longer than I expected, stopping on a floor I hadn't selected before continuing down. I barely noticed at the time. When I stepped out into the hallway, I realized I'd forgotten my keys. They were still in my car. I stood there for a moment, weighing whether it was worth going back down. The hallway was empty, quiet. I checked the time on my phone, thinking about one of the rules that mentioned shared spaces and late hours. I told myself it wouldn't matter. I'd only be gone for a minute. I left my apartment door unlocked. The realization came halfway to the elevator. I stopped walking, replaying the rules in my head, trying to remember if there had been anything specific about doors being left unattended. I couldn't remember the exact wording. That bothered me more than it should have. I went down, retrieved my keys, and came back up as quickly as I could. The elevator doors opened onto the hallway, and everything looked the same at first glance. Then I noticed the light. The ceiling fixture outside my apartment was off. That light was always on at night. I knew that because I used it to find my door when the hallway beyond faded into shadow. I stood there, staring up at it, waiting for it to flicker back on. It didn't. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, telling myself it was a coincidence, a bulb burning out. Maintenance issues, ordinary explanations. I closed the door behind me and locked it, slower than usual. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, the light was still off. I checked the notice board on my way out. The rules were still there, unchanged. I stood closer than I had before, reading them carefully, committing each line to memory. I found the one I was worried about. The wording was vague, but unmistakable in intent. I had broken it. That knowledge settled in slowly. There was no immediate punishment, no warning. Just the quiet understanding that something had been noted. Over the next few days, small things continued to shift. The hallway outside my apartment stayed dim longer than the others. The elevator skipped my floor once, then did it again a day later. Sounds I'd grown used to at night no longer followed their usual pattern. None of it was dramatic enough to point to as proof. Together, it felt deliberate. I started retracing my steps mentally, looking for other moments I might have crossed a line without realizing it. The more I thought about it, the more careful I became. I double-checked locks. I timed my movements. I avoided unnecessary trips into shared spaces altogether. The rules hadn't changed. I had. And that was when I realized the most unsettling part wasn't the consequences themselves, but how easily I had adjusted to them. I avoided the notice board for 2 days, not intentionally at first. I told myself I was busy, that I didn't need to check it again. The rules hadn't changed before. There was no reason to believe they would now. Still, the thought of standing in front of them made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. On the third day, I went out of my way to pass it. The hallway was empty as usual. The board came into view slowly, and before I was close enough to read anything, I already knew something was different. The paper was still there, but it didn't sit the same way it had before. I stepped closer. The list was the same length, the same font, the same spacing. But one line had changed. It wasn't marked. There was no underline or highlight. If I hadn't read the rules as many times as I had, I might not have noticed at all. The wording was almost identical, altered by just a few words. Those words described what I had done. Not in a personal way, not directly. The rule didn't mention keys or specific apartments. It didn't need to. It described a situation that matched mine exactly. The timing, the condition, the consequence. My mouth felt dry as I reread it. There was no date beside the change, no indication of when it had been updated. The paper didn't look replaced. The corners were still flat. The tape hadn't shifted. It was as if the rule had always been written that way, and my memory was the thing that was wrong. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the list until the words began to blur together. I became acutely aware of how still the hallway was. No footsteps, no doors opening, no elevator chime. I looked behind me. The corridor stretched out in both directions, unchanged. Familiar, empty. I had the sudden, irrational thought that I was the only person in the building who had noticed the alteration, that everyone else already knew. I didn't take a photo. I don't know why that decision mattered so much, but it did. Some part of me understood that documenting the change would make it real, in a way I wasn't ready to confront. As long as it existed only there, on that board, it could still be dismissed as misremembering. That explanation didn't last. That evening, the hallway light outside my apartment turned on for the first time since I'd left my door unlocked. Not gradually, not with a flicker. It came on fully, as if responding to something. I stood just inside my doorway, watching the light spill across the carpet. It stayed on for several minutes, then shut off again. I didn't move. That was when the last of my doubt disappeared. The rules weren't suggestions. They weren't guidelines posted for convenience or safety. They were a record, a system that adjusted itself, quietly, without acknowledgement. I hadn't been punished. I had been corrected. The realization settled in slowly, heavier than fear. Whatever was enforcing the rules didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to threaten or warn. It only needed to observe and update. I went to bed that night knowing two things with certainty. The building was aware of what I did, and it was still watching. I didn't check the notice board again after that. I didn't need to. The rules had moved somewhere else, somewhere less visible. They existed in the way I walked down the hall, in the pauses I avoided, in the moments I cut short without consciously deciding to. I didn't think of it as obedience. It felt more like alignment, like learning the shape of a room in the dark. I stopped making unnecessary trips. If I forgot something in my apartment, I weighed whether it was worth going back for. If the elevator doors stayed open longer than usual, I stepped inside without hesitation. I never waited to see if someone else would join me. It felt safer to move when the building expected it. At night, I became aware of how much sound I made. The way my footsteps carried. The quiet click of the lock when I turned the key. I learned how to close my door without letting it echo down the hall. I learned which floorboards inside my apartment creaked and which didn't. I don't remember deciding to learn these things. I just did. The other residents remained distant. If they noticed my changes, they never acknowledged them. Sometimes I wondered if they'd gone through the same process I was going through now, each of us adjusting independently, never comparing notes. That thought made the building feel larger. There were moments when I considered leaving. Not dramatically. Just the practical thought of finding another place, another routine. Each time, the idea stalled before it could fully form. It wasn't fear that stopped me. It was the sense that leaving would require breaking rules I didn't fully understand yet. I didn't know what happened when someone broke the wrong one. The missing door stopped feeling like a mystery entirely. I no longer thought about what might have been behind it or why it wasn't there. It existed as a reference point, a reminder of something accounted for but inaccessible, a space the building had already resolved. I began avoiding that part of the hallway altogether, taking slightly longer routes without questioning why. The detour felt natural, even necessary. Once, I caught myself standing in my apartment, listening before opening the door. Not for footsteps or voices, but for the absence of them. When nothing interrupted the quiet, I stepped out. That was when I realized how deeply the adjustment had set in. I wasn't waiting for instructions anymore. I was anticipating them. The building didn't need to correct me again. It didn't need to change the rules or dim the lights. I had learned the pattern well enough to stay within it on my own. That understanding brought an unexpected calm with it. Not relief, something closer to acceptance. Whatever this place was, it wasn't chaotic. It didn't act randomly. It responded to behavior and refined it over time. The rules weren't there to frighten anyone. They were there to ensure consistency. As long as I stayed within that consistency, nothing else needed to happen. That was the thought I held on to as I lay awake at night, listening to the building settle around me. It was comforting in a way I didn't trust, but I didn't push it away. I had stopped asking what the building wanted. I was too busy making sure I didn't give it a reason to notice me again. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what compliance actually meant. At first, it felt like safety, like I had found the right way to exist inside the building without drawing attention. Nothing else changed. No lights flickered, no rules updated. The quiet stayed consistent, predictable. But consistency has a way of narrowing things without announcing it. I realized one evening that I hadn't stepped outside the building after dark in weeks. Not because I was afraid, but because the timing never seemed right. There was always a reason to stay in. Something small and practical. Something that made leaving feel unnecessary. When I tried to trace that habit back to a starting point, I couldn't find one. The thought of leaving the building altogether came back again, more clearly this time. I stood in my apartment and imagined packing a bag, calling a moving company, explaining why I needed to leave quickly. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not impossible, just inconvenient in a way that discouraged momentum. I noticed something else then. The rules didn't tell anyone to stay. They didn't forbid leaving. They never mentioned it at all. And yet, everything about the building seemed designed to make departure feel like a disruption. Like stepping outside the pattern would require more effort than it was worth. That was the first time I understood what the rules were really doing. They weren't limiting movement, they were shaping decisions. The missing door came back into my thoughts that night. Not as an absence, but as a conclusion. A choice that had already been resolved by the building long before I arrived. Whatever had been there before me had been accounted for, reduced, and removed from consideration. I wondered how many other decisions had been quietly resolved the same way. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay awake listening, not for sounds, but for permission. For some indication that the building still approved of the way I was behaving. When nothing happened, I took that silence as confirmation. The next morning, I passed the notice board without stopping. I didn't need to read the rules anymore. I knew them well enough to stay within their shape. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it made one thing painfully clear. As long as I followed the rules, I could stay. But staying was no longer the same as living there. By the time I reached my apartment door, the thought had settled fully into place, heavy and unavoidable. If I ever wanted to leave, I wouldn't just be breaking a rule. I would be undoing something the building had already decided for me.